get started, what I'd like to do is land acknowledgement. So we honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. Many of you signed up today for a really exciting topic, and that is identifying and managing burnout for organizations with minds of all kinds. Some of the areas that our amazing presenter will touch on today: post-COVID impact on minds of all kinds, identifying neural differences, benefits of neurodistinct thinking, impact areas including relationships and perceptions of others and self, misidentification of quiet quitting, burnout in early learners, and neurodiversity in the workplace and the classroom. So a little bit about our speaker, Carole Jean Whittington. She is a trailblazer in the neurodiversity space, dedicated to empowering ADHD autistic professionals and fostering sustainable energy in their lives. She is the author of Unleashing Sustainable Energy, a strategic approach to transforming spicy burnout for ADHD autistic professionals. As the founder of Mind Your Autistic Brain, her company stands out as one of the largest and only autistic ADHD owned and staffed consulting firm globally, focusing on burnout restoration, accessibility, and neurodiversity. With her vast expertise, Carole Jean hosts the popular weekly talk show called Beyond Autistic Burnout, where this show reaches over 93 countries. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Carole Jean Whittington.
Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I myself am a crochet gal, so I love to see that was some of the things that were being shared in there. I love to cook, and that's one of the things that can also drain me. Both of those things are fun, but they don't always, show up in the way that we want them to when we're tired, when we're overwhelmed, when we've pushed ourselves through the day and we get home and there's nothing left for the fun stuff. I have adult children, and right now we're in Missouri here from Alabama to see my youngest son graduate from Army Engineering AIT. So you get a sort of a fun background so you don't see the really ugly hotel background. Good afternoon, good morning again, and I am so thrilled to be here. I have a background in multiple areas. One of those is in early learning. I studied vision science and vision therapy, specifically around how do we impact and what are the impact of vision, not what we see with our 20/20, our eye acuity, but how our brain, the vision center of our brain, processes what we see and how does that impact how early learners learn to read. And we'll touch on a little bit of that today as well. So I've got a power-packed presentation for you guys, I think, that touch on a lot of different aspects that are going to meet you where you are. So do feel free to put in questions in the chat box. I know that Fanny and Elijah will be checking that out and bringing us in as we go. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. I am a late identified autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic human with an auditory processing delay. And how I discovered what is possible on the other side of late identification, which in itself, I was 39 and 10 months when I discovered that not only was I ADHD, that I discovered in my mid-20s, And that answered some of the questions, but not all of those questions. And at 39 and 10 months, I was going through the identification process with my eldest son. And the neuropsychologist, after 2 months of going through this process with him, he's giving us all of the results. And he leans over his desk and pulls down his little half glasses. And he has this salt and pepper hair and his little sport coat. And he's an older gentleman. And he says, "You know, you were missed." And in my very literal black and white brain, I looked at him and said, "No, I wasn't. I'm right here. No one missed me." And he chuckled and looked at me and nodded his head. And he says, "You need to come back and see me." And I said, "Okay." Did not register. The penny had not yet dropped. In a few minutes, maybe it was 10 minutes or so into the conversation, he was going through, hey, these are the things that your son is good at. These are the things where he's going to need support. And all of a sudden it hit me and I went, whoa, hang on a minute. And he looked at me and said, "Yes." I said, "Are you saying I'm autistic? Somebody missed me?" And he said, "See the receptionist on your way out and come back and see me." That was the beginning of the most incredible journey of my life. I started this process, and the reason I bring this conversation in today, especially to this group, is I think it's so important to understand how early burnout can begin to impact our early learners, specifically those who are autistic, ADHD, or twice exceptional. I myself am considered twice exceptional. I remember sitting on my bed. I was in my school uniform, and I know it was a Friday because I had on my maroon blazer for Julius T. Wright School. And it had the emblazoned crest and the embossed brass buttons. And it was my favorite thing to wear because it always made me feel safe. It was like a knight donning armor to go into battle. Because for me, school and life felt like a daily battle. But I was teased because you were only required to wear your blazer on a Friday because that was assembly day at our school. And if you wore it any other time, people thought that was weird. Well, people thought a lot of things I did were weird. But for me, it was comfortable. But I know it was a Friday because I was wearing that blazer. And it was really important that day because I had felt anything but protected. I felt overwhelmed. I felt exhausted. I felt confused. I felt like a failure. I felt like I was doing everything wrong. My mom came in and she said, "Honey, why are you crying? What's wrong?" And she sat down and she put her arm around me. And at age 6, I looked at my mother and I said, "I want to die." That was the first sign and the first experience of autistic burnout. And this is so very common. I work with hundreds of late identified autistic and ADHD humans in burnout every year and speak to large groups. So I actually speak to thousands every year. And as we get into sort of the history of burnout, we start to identify that the majority of people who are autistic or ADHD begin to experience burnout starting around age 4, and then it hits very hard around age 6. And if we look at the learning model in school, we can sort of pinpoint where and why it starts to shift between 4 and 6. And that is because the demand increases exponentially, specifically around reading. You see some fun images here, and you see some that may be a little challenging and may make you wonder. There's a wheelchair there in the corner. At the age of 42, I was in the worst burnout of my life. I was in a level 5, what I call a ghost pepper level burnout. That's when you're so hot, you're not. And at that point, my body had started to shut down due to some co-occurring health conditions. And we'll talk about that in the presentation in just a minute. But I was completely bedridden. There were some days I couldn't even lift my hand to feed myself. In 2015, that was when I had hit probably the end of that burnout, where I had hit that rock bottom where you're like, either I figure this out or it's over. And that's where my journey began. And that's where that restoration and transformation began. Because at that point, I knew not only was I ADHD, but I was autistic. And that meant that I wasn't a broken, flawed, failing adult, but that I was just perceiving and processing the world in a different way. So today, that is transformed. Getting out of burnout. I am now entering year 4 of thriving and living burnout, shutdown, and meltdown free for the first time in almost 40 years. I'll be 50 this year. And that means that the relationships I have in my life have transformed because I have the energy to be in a relationship. And some of you guys were sharing, managing my adult children, being a parent. All of those things can be very exhausting. This is my mom and dad. My mother just turned 80 in June, and she is still a full-time director of a preschool. And it's why I'm so very passionate about early learning. My dad is 86, and my sister is just a phenomenal human. This is my partner, Josh. But this has all led to finally being able to lead the life I knew was mine, but I had never been able to fully embrace because I was always in some degree of burnout. This year, I have been recognized as the Neurodivergent Achiever of the Year and have been added to an incredible short list, and the awards are being presented later this month. I also have presented at Google and NBC Universal Studios and helped train their employees in and around burnout. And it has been life-changing for me. What I've learned along the way is that this experience of being neurodistinct, and I say distinct and not divergent for some linguistic reasons, it is not a linear journey. It is anything but. There are moments in the valley going between mountaintops, because there are those mountaintops, those rare air moments. And it is the compassionate curiosity and the grace that we extend ourselves and those in our lives and those we are in relationship together that transform everything. Is it too hard to hear? Let's see. I see we've got some comments here about sound. Are we good?
You sound fine, Carol. I'm sorry to
Okay.
everyone attending. We do have neutral settings on the audio. We do ask that if you're experiencing any difficulties, that if you can, please move to using headphones or a more quieter area. Thank you so much. And also, Carol, I'm not sure if you want to go into presentation mode with your slides.
Okay. It sometimes just doesn't make it where I can access the information I need.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So this is what you'll be learning today, what we'll be talking about. We're going to talk about some of these post-COVID impacts that we have on minds of all kinds, because there's some elements that maybe you weren't aware of. We'll talk about the differences in neurotypes, the benefits of neurodistinct thinking, the impact areas, including our relationships and more. Let's get started. So how is neurodiversity in the post-COVID world? What are some of the benefits and the challenges during lockdown for minds of all kinds? So here's one of the biggest, I want to acknowledge the challenges. This was not easy. This was not easy on us as a country. This was not easy on us globally as humanity. But I think those challenges that we have faced have also brought us where we are today. One of the things that is discussed so often in the neurodistinct community, and we share this with one another cautiously in a lot of us, because people who have experienced some really hard things, we have a balance, we have a harmony of positive and negative. And some of the benefits of lockdown for a lot of people who are not just neurodistinct, autistic, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, sensory sensitivity processing disorders, but also people of all variations in disability, we were finally getting access that we had been asking for years, for decades. Can we work remotely? No, that's too difficult. Really? When lockdown happened, how difficult was it for us to really figure that out? How quick did that happen? It makes us question things, doesn't it? A lot of the benefits were that people were able to work in curated environments. We cut down on a lot of the stress on our physical and emotional and sensory systems as we navigated going from home to a physical location. When we could put supports in place for ourselves, when we could work in our home environment where we were feeling more supported, where we were able to regulate our systems in a way that we weren't able to, having to get on a train or get in a car or get on a bus, sometimes for an hour or more. Those things made a tremendous difference for so many people. And as we are moving back and we are getting into a lot of heated debate, and I think you have all seen these articles online as well, Harvard Business Review and Fast Company and so many other top online business journals, the debate around going back to work in the traditional sense. And I think that we have to look at that. So many teachers found it beneficial and some found it really challenging. And I think we have to look at all of that. Who is benefiting and how? How can we create environments that help continue that support that someone has found that works best for them? And as we're transitioning back to this new era after COVID, we have to start looking at what are our peak performance times? What are our preferred communication modalities? And what are our processing and times and needs? Because we all have them, and it's part of what we need to consider as we are moving forward. So let's talk about identifying some neurodifferences, because sometimes we have a big group that says, oh yes, we are definitely well aware we are a neurodistinct population, and then we have some that are very very different. And sometimes we have people that are like, well, I know some folks, but I don't have firsthand experience. So let's kind of go over a little bit of this so that we're all speaking and understanding from the same place. So first off, I want to highlight some pretty spectacular autistic and ADHD humans in the world and how their neurodistinct brains have impacted us today. Haley Moss is one of the first openly autistic attorneys in the state of Florida. She is an incredible advocate in leading autism and inclusion initiatives in the legislation and legal field. And I bet you know or have heard of Susan Boyle. She is autistic, she is Scottish, and she's the singer that performed on Britain's Got Talent. And her incredible impact in the world, she has shared her talent, she has entertained global audiences, and she's incredibly captivating. So part of this is also kind of debunking those social misunderstandings about who we are as autistic people, being social and performing and being in large social groups. I think Susan debunks a lot of those things. And one I think you may know quite well, Mr. Nikola Tesla. He is suspected, based on his journals and observations from others, that he could have possibly been autistic or ADHD himself. He was an electrical engineer who made discoveries that led to alternating current, or AC as we know it. So what are some types of neurodistinct brains and bodies? And I specifically say brains and bodies here for a very specific reason. My background is also in the human brain and body. And so when we look at what does it mean to be neurodistinct, meaning that your brain processes and perceives the world in a way that operates from a different perspective than perhaps some other people. And that is, part of that includes the sensory system and the nervous system. It is much more heightened. So if you look at some of the things that happen when we look at autistic brains and we look at ADHD brains, we look at non-linear thinking. We look at brains that ADHD may appear to be very scattered or jump around in a conversation. That is part of that non-linear thinking. When we look at research studies that compare neurotypical or neuromajority brains to autistic brains in an fMRI machine, and they are given a task to execute, so a specific physical and cognitive task, and both brains are looked at, the fMRI reveals that in the neurotypical brain, 3 or 4 condensed areas of the brain light up. And that shows that those are what are being used and engaged to perform that task. When you look at the autistic brain in that same exact task execution, the brain is lighting up in 5 to 7 areas in a much larger area. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of neural pruning that happens in autistic brains. So as the developing brain ages, in early years, it prunes off the areas and neural pathways that it doesn't need. Well, an autistic brain doesn't do that. We keep them. And so that means that our processing time takes longer and we use more areas of our brain, which means we see patterns very quickly. We see solutions and possibilities that you may not notice because our brain is seeing more of them and processing more of them. It also means that it takes us a little longer to process information because we are processing a larger amount of data. That also includes in the neurodistinct category Down syndrome, dyscalculia, which is difficulty with math, dysgraphia, which is difficulty with writing, dyslexia, which is difficulty with reading, dyspraxia, which is difficulty with coordination, sensory processing disorders, and Tourette's syndrome. So these are all of the things that fall under, and there's some other areas as well, but these are the main areas that fall underneath that neurodivergent or neurodistinct umbrella. And it isn't just the brain that is neurodistinct, it is also the body that is neurodistinct. So let's talk about how does this neurodistinctiveness show up? So there's a lot of co-occurrence. For instance, I am both autistic and ADHD. There was a time in the DSM, when we'll talk about medical deficit models, when it was said you can't be both. And there's a lot of studies now, and there's a huge project that's been going on in the Netherlands for the last few years, looking at how autistic and ADHD thinking may actually be along the same grouping. But you can be autistic, you can be ADHD, or you can be what is called ADHD, both autistic and ADHD. So there are also things that are very common if you are one or both of these that you will probably have. And that can include auditory processing. That can be the auditory processing delay or a disorder that may be more intense and include several other areas of your auditory profile. That can include visual processing challenges, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia. Some common co-occurring health conditions. And this is really important to note because when I say it's not just the brain, it's the body, we have to holistically look at the whole person. And most often there's something called the trifecta. And that is if you are autistic or autistic and ADHD, we are seeing more and more research looking into this, and we are identifying that the percentage of these 3 trifecta co-occurring conditions happening for a person who is autistic and ADHD or autistic is so very much higher than the general population. And that includes MCAST, which is mast cell activation syndrome. Guys, this is your allergy response. And we've already seen the research showing that 17% of the autistic population has more allergies than any other part. And the mast cell activation syndrome can show up. And especially in early learners, you can have students that are, breaking out in rashes and they're itchy or they're uncomfortable or they get really hot or they get uncomfortable, their skin hurts or they're crying about their hair hurting or things are hurting their skin. And you think maybe they're just sensitive or they're being a little dramatic sometimes. It could also be that co-occurring health condition that's showing up, and it could be neurodistinct. POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. For most people, this is they stand up and they get a little dizzy. There are extreme versions, which show up in our autistic and ADHD population. I'm one of these folks. I have the trifecta. And POTS is more like, I'm the human version of the fainting goat, and I don't look nearly as cute or as funny on a video. So these are some things that can show up and happen. And Ehlers-Danlos or hypermobility. So this is where you may have kids that seem to be, they're double jointed. They're kind of like Gumby. They're super flexible. Like they're doing all kinds of crazy things all over your classroom or, all over the place. And they're really flexible. But as we're aging, that is a really big part because we can also injure ourselves very easily. So there's some things to look at because all of these are components of how we learn. Because when our body is not performing at its best and there are challenges and barriers, that is also challenges and barriers that we bring to our learning. So what is the perspective here? I want to talk about the medical deficit model versus the asset or social model. So the medical deficit model says that you deviate from the norm, quote unquote. You are disordered or defective, broken. And for most of my life, I already felt that way. And part of what I do in Mind Your Autistic Brain is to help bring a shift of perspective. Because when we can look at the fact that I know that we say that's a neurotypical or neuromajority, and I'm going to say I also like to disrupt that. And I like to say neurodominant because as we know, as parents and educators and just as people, history is written by those who tend to be the loudest or won the battle, right? And we have created neurodistinctiveness in the current conversation from a lens and perspective of a medical deficit model. And I want to also say that I don't believe that we are a minority. I believe neurodistinct brains are the majority. And I think it's so important that we shift the lens and the perspective to looking at what is the asset, the social model, because it is throughout history that our brain, our neurotype has existed. For as long as humanity has existed, we have existed. We are a tremendous part of how humanity has advanced in innovation and creativity. And I think it's really important that we look at what are the benefits and how are we being compassionately curious around one another. Not looking at, oh, you're not normal, you're weird, you're different, you're broken. But how are you doing things differently? How might that influence or impact how I do things? So let's look at some impact areas in neurodiversity. Relationships, this is a number one thing. In Mind Your Autistic Brain, we also have Her Brain Connection Lab with my partner, Dr. Ali Arena. We have the neurodiverse communication ecosystem, and we come in and teach teams, and we also do this in relationships. How do we communicate effectively with one another? What are our communication styles? Because how we deliver information and how we like to receive information can be two totally different things. Our relationships and how we communicate and how we prefer to communicate to give information and how we like to receive information, that shows up in all of our aspects of life. From how we communicate with the people at home, how do we communicate with the people at school and at work? And if we're not aware of our own communication style, and we're not aware of how we give and receive information, we can be taking the things that other people say, and we can be perceived, and the way that we give information can be taken in a way that we did not intend. So one type and one style of communication is direct. And if we look at how we normally hear, oh, autistic people are very blunt, they're very direct, they can be very rude. Well, there's a heart behind each type of communication. And I think when we start to look with a lens of compassionate curiosity, we can look and understand that direct communication, and I'm a direct communicator, means that I'm trying to deliver information in a very direct and clean and clear way to help you solve a problem because I care about you. And I want you to be able to move forward as quickly as possible. That really changes the context, doesn't it? That changes the emotional charge, that changes the story behind what we think someone has just said to us. And sometimes how that can play out is the perception of ourselves. If we aren't aware of our communication styles and we're not communicating and sharing our heart of communication with the people in our life, then we can take those reactions of like, you're so rude, you're such a jerk. Why can't you be nicer when you say things? Or, Susan, I think we need to have a talk about how you send out emails. I think we need some more pleasantries before you dive right into the information. Or here's one. When you're in a project meeting or you're in a group meeting, and maybe this is a new initiative that you're talking about, and there's that one person, that negative Nancy, that immediately goes to why this won't work. All of this, nope, that won't work. How many of you guys have had somebody in your life who has been that this won't work person? Nope, can't do it. It won't work. Well, that person may be seeing 50 to 100 steps ahead. They've looked at all the information and in a matter of seconds have processed all of that and have already identified some of the barriers that are coming up. And they don't necessarily deliver it in a way that you are asking them to go deeper. Because normally when we hear, oh, that's not going to work, or that's going to be a problem right there, that's going to be a barrier. And sometimes the group response is, oh man, really again? Or could you not be so negative? Can we just like be excited about the project? But the understanding that's being missed and the compassionate curiosity lens that shifts that conversation and your perception of that person is, I see this barrier. I see this challenge that we're going to face if we don't go ahead and address it right now or fix it, or if we don't shift or pivot, because I want this project to be a success, because you guys are important to me. This company or this team is important to me. And if you start to shift and understand that maybe that's the person you bring into the strategy and planning session, and you get their input first, because they're going to help alleviate some of that. But what can happen is when the world is responding to us from that external place of you're being a jerk, you're being negative, you're being rude, we start to take that on as who we might think we are. And that self-awareness and that self-acceptance is really hard when the world around you is telling you you're doing it wrong. There's no curiosity, there's no compassion, there's no awareness of others outside of themselves as well. How do we start to overcome these stereotypes and these biases? By asking compassionately curious questions, by catching it. If we're telling ourselves a story about why Bob in accounting tells us that we have to do things a certain way, and he gets really irritated if we don't do it a certain way. How do we start to just shift to a place of connection, that we all see things in a different way? So let's talk about burnout in minds of all kinds, because guys, this is a big hot topic. This is one of the things that I have more questions. I have more engagement and conversation around this than anything else. So let's talk about some signs of burnout. Burnout can happen as early as age 6 that we've identified, where it can really significantly start to show up in our early learners. How can we start to identify that? Some of the ways that we can is we look at some of the physical symptoms that show up. A lot of stomach aches. We have maybe a lot of missed time at school. They're out a lot. Sometimes it can show up as a lot of sinus infection, sore throat, stomach ache, gastrointestinal issues. That's how stress starts to show up in the bodies, especially of little folks. And guys, it follows you into adulthood. Some of the things that we can see are emotional dysregulation that might be happening earlier in the day when it seems like we haven't had a whole lot of stressors. It's not necessarily a lack of nap time or anything like that yet. Maybe we haven't done a lot of big cognitive load tasks throughout the day, but I have a child that is very dysregulated consistently. Those are some signs to start looking at. Burnout shows up in different ways in our career stages. How burnout showed up in my 20s was very different in how it showed up in my 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I have a wonderful article that's in the online portal that I created just for this event, where you guys can go in and get those identifiers to look at how burnout shows up in different career stages and different ages. Because how that, the stressors, like in my 20s, I was looking at, okay, I'm starting my career. I want to make sure that I'm not making any mistakes. And as a neurodistinct person, a lot of that was a lot of masking that I was doing, not recognizing that I was masking. And I didn't just mask, I masked what I said, the professional level of camouflaging as the cutest little chameleon in the world you never saw. And those things can lead to greater degrees of burnout. One of the things as a manager, as a director, as a programmed executive, that's really important to know, especially if you are here from one of those wonderful nonprofits or a government agency, we need to talk about the term quiet quitting for a second. Quiet quitting can be misidentified for someone who is in burnout. Someone who is in burnout is showing up, doing the absolute best that they can do with the energy, skills, and resources that they have. They are not quiet quitting. They are in burnout. And I think it's really important to identify there is a difference, because recent research shows that a third of managers, almost 30% of managers, said that as a response to employees they perceived as quiet quitting, that they quiet fired. And folks, let's talk about this for a minute. The money and the time that we invest in hiring really amazing talent, it costs us 2, 3, 4 times as much to go out and replace that person. But we hired that person for a reason. And we have to also do some accountability checking to say, what are we doing within the organization to support the amazing talent that we've hired? If they're in burnout, what can we do? And a lot of those things go back to creating a culture of preferences, not reasonable accommodations, because what's reasonable for one person is not reasonable for another. So I don't think that that is necessarily the best term. But I think when we look at a culture of preferences, because we all have them, we all have sensory needs. My sensory profile is going to be different. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But I think we've got to understand there is a very big difference, and there's a misidentification that's happening in the world that we have to be aware of, because right now, statistically, 77% of our work population right now says that they are experiencing some degree of burnout. 77%. That's over 3/4 of your workforce. And if 3/4 of your workforce is experiencing some degree of burnout and they're showing up doing the best that they can do, are you judging them and saying you're quiet quitting? You're just doing the bare minimum to get by? Let's get compassionately curious, guys, and let's create better environments. So let's talk about how spicy is your burnout. So I created a spicy pepper scale of burnout, from a poblano pepper level 1 to a jalapeno pepper level 2 to a cayenne pepper level 3, a habanero pepper level 4, and a ghost pepper level 5. When you're so hot, you're not. So let's run through some of the experiences of what this may feel like. So you know you're exhausted almost all the time now, but don't have a clear way to get out of it. Is that something you're experiencing right now? You're scaling back on demands and focusing on rest every weekend, and it helps for Monday and Tuesday. But by the middle to the end of the week, you're right back where you started. You're using at least 2 or 3 self-care tips each week and trying new ones, but nothing feels sustainable. It's like you can do it a couple times, but I can't do it all the time. Those fun things you love to do aren't feeling fun anymore, but more like a chore. And that can feel really sad or depressing, like crocheting, cooking, playing with your kids, the things that you love to do, they're just not fun anymore. 70% or more of your energy is spent on doing things others expect or that you have to do to survive. You don't feel connected to your authentic self. You're giving everyone else what they want and need instead of what you need and that feels authentic to you. It feels like you understand what to do to get out of burnout, but it still doesn't work. You know you're missing something hidden. You never get out of burnout long enough to really feel good and live the authentic life you know is yours. You may spend most of the weekend in bed or on the sofa. However, you know it isn't depression. There's something else. So if you're experiencing any of these, you're likely making some of these mistakes to try and fix it. You're trying to fix it, but it's not really working. It could be that you're seeking just to feel better with no real destination on how that's going to look. And hey, that's where I started. I was like, I just wanted to stop sucking. I just wanted to feel better. I just wanted to not suck so bad. You could be exploring self-care and trying new approaches, but nothing feels sustainable. It's like it requires so much effort to do the self-care thing that it doesn't really feel like you can do it consistently. Overthinking and constantly analyzing the suggested tips and articles and online groups, but you could feel stuck and unsure of where to even start with that. Are you using a lot of your sick days and vacation days, or even figuring out maybe how can you use FMLA to try and get enough rest to get out of burnout? Making a few changes that help you feel better, and then you end up back in burnout a few weeks or months later, trying to figure it out all over again. And that's called the burnout restoration illusion trap. And a lot of us have fallen into that. I know I did. So how do we define, or what are the differences between a burnout for one neurotype and the burnout for those of us who are a neurodistinct neurotype? There's symptoms of burnout that happen in your body and your mind, right? So these are common. This is what both neurotypes experience. So emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, we all experience that as part of burnout. And this is the internal experience of burnout, a lot of these, because there's also external. So anxiety or an elevated sense of worry more than your norm. Issues falling or staying asleep. Guys, sleep is one of the biggest impact areas in burnout. And one of the things that it can impact most is your long-term memory storage, because that happens during REM sleep, and also your working memory. It's very important to recognize the impact that sleep has when you're experiencing burnout. And this is all degrees of burnout. Also, trouble with your memory, poor job performance, like executive dysfunction starts to show up, headaches, fatigue, feelings of hopelessness. So there's a most common misidentification for neurodistinct humans when it comes to burnout, and that is we can often be misidentified, not just as quiet quitters, folks, but as experiencing depression. And depression can be an element of burnout, but it is also something that can be unique within itself as an experience. So if you begin to put things in place and the burnout is being alleviated and restoration is coming in, you will see signs of that depression or that experience of depression diminishing. If it is a pervasive depression that is specifically depression within itself, be it neurochemical or otherwise, then it will not be eliminated or resolved through restoration. I think that's important to point out. A lot of people fall into the chronic cycle burnout loop, and that is when the cycle between levels of burnout with only brief periods of partial restoration between those cycles. And the way that this impacts neurodistinct brains in particular is, unlike a different neurotype, we can lose our skills and abilities permanently, or they will not return to the same degree that they were before we went into burnout. That is one of the most impactful and important things to note. Also, one of the things that happens specifically more so for neurodistinct people than another neurotype is that our sensory profile blueprint is drastically impacted. It's very different in burnout than it is in Thrive. I might still have an auditory processing challenge when I'm in Thrive, but instead of being at an 8 or a 10 degree out of 10, when I'm in burnout, it's maybe a 3 or a 4. Like I can hear the fish tank in the other room and it drives me crazy, but I can tolerate it. But when I'm in burnout, it sounds like somebody's nails in a chalkboard in the same room. The other thing is the burnout restoration illusion trap. And this is when you begin to recover and you're feeling or experiencing feeling good, maybe having more energy than you had before, because let's say you were stuck in a habanero level 4 burnout for a really long time, months, sometimes decades for some folks. And things in your life changing, your needs are getting met, and stress has reduced. So you start to feel better. But because you had been in a level 4 for so long, that became your norm, hedonic adaptation. So what happened is you move down the scale to maybe a level 3, and it feels so good that you believe you're no longer in burnout. However, the things are not in place to help you continue to restore and move down the scale. So the next thing you know, you're moving back into one of those other levels of burnout very quickly. So the key elements to know about burnout restoration is that you need to know your needs blueprint. There are 30 basic human needs. Most of us think of like the top 5, right? We think about Maslow's, we think at the bottom of the pyramid, which by the way, there was no pyramid by Maslow, but we think about our physical needs, food, water, shelter, safety, physical safety, financial security, right? But there's so much more. And that may not be your number one unmet need. And burnout is essentially consistent and chronic unmet needs. Do you know what your needs are besides those top 5? Do you know what your love needs are, your esteem needs? And do you know how those are impacting you in your life? What is bringing in the most energy and what is the biggest hole in your energy bucket? The other component that is a key to restoration is to know your sensory profile. And there's not just 5 sensory areas, folks. There's 2 more. And if you're neurodistinct, those other 2 are critical. And those 2 make a difference. And I have a wonderful resource in the online portal for you and a beautiful conversation with Bridget Finero to go into all 7 areas of your sensory profile and why they matter. So bringing energy in and effectively managing the energy you have is the most effective way to restore your reserves, boost your mood, regulate your sensory system, and you do that through your needs blueprint and your sensory profile. And when you supercharge your restoration with energy actions that are sustainable, and I have a whole approach to the 7 areas of rest other than sleep, and we do deep dives into sleep, your life becomes unstoppable. So that free additional resource with training and all types of wonderful things, including the 7 steps to having the burnout conversation as the manager with your employee and as the employee with your manager. That is a very important conversation. And one of the things that I don't think a lot of people realize is that there's a large majority of neurodistinct folks who are educators and who are early educators. And how we look at burnout for them is really critical because they are doing the work that is so very important in the lives of our children. I have a new book out, Unleashing Sustainable Energy, and this is published by Hyperlexic Publishing, which is breaking publishing glass ceilings in accessibility. This is accessibility for one price. This book is doing something no other book has ever done. It comes in accessibility versions of Open Sans font and Open Dyslexic font, as well as audio, and this is where it's really great, video with captions. Because when you're in burnout, how you process and take in information is very different, and it changes from moment to moment. And one of the things that a lot of people can lose is their ability to read and process information. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Yes, 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 and yes. Wow. Wow. I can't believe the time is almost up. It doesn't make sense. But we do have some questions. We got to have you back because you got to go further into that burnout. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So here's the first question, and we only have a few minutes, so I hope we'll be able to get through all of them. can a person have 3 occurrences such as autism, ADHD, and OCD? I think I kind of know the answer to
Yes.
that, but that's a question.
Yes, you absolutely can. That is a very common profile.
Okay. Here's another question. Do you think preconception of what autism looks like may prevent earlier diagnosis, especially with those who may be higher functioning?
Yes, I do. And I actually have a campaign that is called What Autism Looks Like, because it is about debunking that, specifically for minority groups, for women, for people of color. If you are also in an intersectional population, you're missed. We are so missed. We are an unseen group. And it is so very vital that we are talking about and shifting this conversation. It's one of the things that I do in part of the narrative that I share. And it's, what does autism really look like? And one of the campaigns we have coming up this year is specifically around autistics in the workforce. What does that look like? Where are we? You know, we're not just in tech. We're in amazing creative areas. We have people who are historical docents. I mean, drone pilots, I mean, all sorts of things. I mean, creators and artists. So we really have got to stop looking at through that. When I talk about that medical deficit versus the asset social model, this is where that really comes in, because what we see and hear and perceive to be someone who is autistic is not accurate. And one of the biggest, most harmful things that we can do is to use a functioning label, because I was originally identified, even though DSM-5 was out, as having Asperger's and being quote unquote high functioning. And that is not true, because then that puts me at a disadvantage, because I have an IQ of 138. So I'm also a twice exceptional student, but I was missed, and I wasn't identified as even having dyslexia until a few years ago, or an auditory processing delay, because I'm so smart. I'm so verbal. I was hyperlexic. I was reading, even with dyslexia, I was reading at an early age and comprehending. So how many people are being missed because we have a perception that isn't accurate? Great question.
This is good. Okay, there are more. What types of accommodations are helpful for getting out of burnout while continuing to work?
That is actually something I talk about.
Yeah. So they actually said that they took the time off and came back to work. So I guess that's that third pepper that you spoke about, how you're over there in the space, and then all of a sudden something happens and you come back to the to the burnout in a stronger fashion. Anyways, that's the question that's on the table. That was there.
Absolutely. And the UnVeiling Method addresses this. We have 4 phases of the process. And what we do in foundations is we look at your needs profile, because when you can't ask for accommodations if you don't first have the self-awareness of what it is that you need. What is draining the most energy from you? And you also have to look at, what is your sensory profile blueprint? And this works for all neurotypes. I have people that come in who are not neurodistinct, and it's really amazing, the transformation that happens for both neurotypes with this program. But you have to know, what are my sensory needs as well? What is the blueprint? Because no matter your neurotype, your sensory profile is impacted differently in burnout than it is in your thrive. So we've got to know, what is your number one unmet need? Because for you, it might be emotional safety. And it's not the external piece, it's that I don't internally feel emotionally safe. I don't feel like I'm seen, heard, and understood, and that it is safe for me to have a feeling in my body. Maybe you're suppressing it or pushing it down. A lot of times there's so much past trauma, be that micro trauma to big T trauma, that comes as being late identified, or sometimes just living through life in general, especially if you are part of an intersectional or minority population. So we got to take all of that into account, because we can't ask for accommodations when we don't know what we need.
Wow. We have more questions. I hope I can get to at least one more. And that is, where can they find your book and the tools for the dyslexic worker? I think that's where,
all of that is in your online portal.
Okay.
You
Oh,
have access to the book, and there's also a companion workbook. So this is also one of the wonderful accessibility features of my book. This is the print version, and it is spiral bound for physical accessibility. It also comes in different font sizes so that you can read and see all of the print, no matter what your vision needs.
okay. I think this might be the last question. Maybe
Okay.
not, because there's two more. How would people who may have a neurological disorder be protected in the workplace?
So are you in the United States, and are you asking about ADA, Americans
Yes,
with
I guess
Disability
that's what
Act?
it sounds like, doesn't
Okay.
it?
So this is a big conversation that we're having in our community right now, specifically around disclosure, because there is a really bad catch-22 when we're looking at legal rights and protection. So it says that if you do not disclose, and you know when you accept a job or interview for a job, then when you do, if something comes up, let's say you horrific burnout, let's say something happens, maybe something changes, and you're like, okay, I need to disclose this because I really need accommodations and need help. And sometimes companies can look at that and they can say, well, you did not disclose previously, you are now being held accountable, and that can put your job in jeopardy. There's some really tough conversations, because a lot of places are not psychologically safe to disclose. Because the minute, I mean, you can be a high performer, you can be there for a really long time. Let's say you're late identified, and this has happened to several of my clients. They disclose because they get comfortable, they share, they're trying to change the conversation, and then all of a sudden, anything from that point forward comes back to, oh, it's because you were ADHD that you didn't show up on time. That's why you were late for the meeting. So it's a really tough place. It's a tough conversation, and it's not a direct or easy answer.
Oh,
Yeah, and at-will employment laws, definitely.
Carole Jean, we're right at 1 o'clock. This was totally phenomenal. You know, you got to come back and you got to share more on this topic. All of you, we just want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing this wealth of information. And we just want to say thank you. And to everyone else who came, and you could have spent your hour at someplace else, but you chose to spend it with us. And for that, we say thank you. And we want to gift you back your day and say, have a fantastic day, but be kind to yourself and to others. Much love.
Thank you.